We're excited now to open up this conversation live. And I want to take a look because we have audience members registered from all over, including Canmore, Fairbanks, Regina, Chelsea, Sackville, and beyond. Great to see you. And we encourage you, everyone joining from home, to share this conversation on social media. Yes, it is very meta. So you can tag us on any of the platforms at the Walrus, and the hashtag is #Walrus Talks. Now, if you have a question for our speakers and you're watching on Zoom, you can submit it in the chat, or if you're in Facebook, in the comments. I'm now going to welcome back our talkers for our Q&A session. So if each of you could turn on your cameras, we'll kick things off. I have a few questions to get us going, and then we'll get to our questions from the audience. And since we have two Karas, I'll use your initials from your last name. So Kara BB and Kara Z, just to avoid any confusion. I'd like to kick things off, Tamara, with something that you mentioned, which is a binary, that often when we talk about the internet, tech, the platforms, it's good or bad. Why do you think this viewpoint is so mainstream in terms of how we frame the conversation?
Well, it's interesting because I think, so this year I teach a digital politics course, and for the first time ever with these students was the first time that they all came in and was like, internet's the worst. And I was like, whoa, what has happened? But they started this semester after January the 6th, right? This is a group of students. Usually when I teach this course, they all come in and they're like, young people are going to change the world through the internet. It's the greatest thing ever, right? And you know, the very big, I mean, part of it is that the technologies that came before television were not technologies that allowed for these conversations. They didn't do this work that the internet does. And so I think, as many people pointed out, is that there's affordances in digital technologies that don't exist on television, on radio, in newspapers. And so it was easy for people to link those democratic values to those affordances.
So there's a bit of a reaction then that happens
absolutely,
depending on where we are.
And partly it was that, you know, like democracy, we want to improve democracy. Like that's a great thing for us to all want to do. But I think many of us who've been studying this for a very long time were a bit sort of surprised at 2016 when the misinformation crisis hit. We were all like, whoa, technology can be used in this kind of way. And I think, you know, many of us, again, lots of us were surprised and unsurprised in January. You're like, you're like, of course technology would lead to this, but yet we were all kind of like, whoa. And so it's, you know, I understand the binary, but I think the reason is that we really thought that the internet was going to be the thing that moved us forward. And in some ways it has, but it doesn't at the same time.
Tamara, you bring up misinformation and you point to how we can define it for so many things, whether it's an election or Timothy, as you were speaking to COVID and beyond. Timothy, there's misinformation, and then there's the term disinformation, and I often hear people confusing the terms. Can you just clarify the difference and what we mean?
Yeah, I like to use misinformation kind of as the umbrella term, but really this falls on a continuum, right? At one end of the continuum, you know, let's call it the really evil end of the continuum. You have entities spreading inaccurate information for a particular malevolent goal, right? You know,
deliberately.
These are conspiracy theorists that they're doing it for a very particular reason. And sometimes it is malevolent, and they might even be doing it just to create a chaotic information environment. And you move along that continuum, and there are people knowingly spreading things that are inaccurate to forward, for example, an ideological agenda. And then you move along the continuum a little bit more, and you have individuals that are spreading misinformation knowingly to sell products, to build a wellness brand. And then you move along that continuum a little further, and there may be individuals who are, again, selling products, but hey, they believe it. You know, they really do think this is going to boost your immune system. No, it's not, by the way. And then you move further along that, and you have individuals that are just spreading information because they want to do what's right. You know, they're trying to figure things out for themselves, for their families, for their loved ones. That's misinformation, but their intent isn't there. But you know what? All along that continuum, it can do real harm. But the reason it's important to reflect on that continuum is because there might be different interventions that you want to use depending on the intent, and this goes perhaps to Kara Zed, some of what she said, and also the kinds of interventions you want to use with critical thinking, to go with Carrie's at Bibi, about teaching people how to tease out what's correct and what's not correct. So yeah, I think it's a really important question.
So Kara, Bibi, I'd like to bring you into this, because in your talk, you mentioned that a small group can have a significant impact. And I assume that's in a good way, which is exciting, but also in a negative way, which can be dangerous. Can you build on that and perhaps give us an example?
Yeah, you're very right. It can be in a good way or a not so good way. I think, in the research we've done around online hate, one of the things that we were observing is that, the loudest minority, 10%, are really who are pushing the dial in an online community and setting the tone, the norms, the values for that space. But one of the challenges is the sort of nature, the online environment often gives us the sense that it's a much larger group of people, or in fact, a consensus view that is holding, whatever the norm or value or ideology may be in that space. And so I think that's, one of the key challenges, and particularly around online hate. We also found out that people, particularly young people, are less likely to intervene if they believe that the view is held by a large majority. We know that youth are very much concerned about social harmony. The thoughts, opinions, and of their peers matter greatly to them. I think it's also true for many of us as adults. So it can, in fact, work to our disadvantage when we think that, oh, well, most people in this space must believe what this, this small contingent of folks are actually saying. So again, just that piece around like the importance of educating people about how sort of norms and values are shaped and formed in online spaces. And there are roles for a multitude of different players. Platforms have a role, in being a lot more transparent about community standards, how those are set, and what the repercussions will be when those standards are violated.
Great, thanks. I want to bring the other Kara in. As you were speaking about the law, we also know that the law stretches and expands. So where is the law in catching up with technology? How far behind is it? I don't want to say how far ahead of it is, because we've seen that there is a gap.
Yeah, it's pretty far behind, I would say. We've got a lot of the harms that we're talking about and that the government is talking about trying to address with new online harms legislation are things that are already illegal, and that arguably the tools already exist. But you need not just the law to keep up, you also need police services to have the resources and the technology acumen to navigate some of these issues. If you think about the controversy around Pornhub, and this was clearly illegal content on a massive scale, and I think there were legal tools that could have been deployed to deal with that problem, but they weren't. And I'm just I'm not totally clear on the reasons for that. Some of it has to do with jurisdiction. Some of it is the fact that it is really difficult, with regulating the internet, because our laws work in, a particular jurisdictional context. It's Canadian law or it's Ontario law, but the internet doesn't work like that. There are no borders. And so, I think the challenges that the online environment presents are challenges that our law has not really done a particularly good job at keeping up with. Sometimes the courts are moving forward, but even if you think about the amount of time that it takes for a case, for example, to get all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, you have the Supreme Court looking at privacy in text messages, and it doesn't make it up to the court until the technology has kind of changed so significantly by the time that case gets to court that it's almost irrelevant. So we've not done a great job of keeping up. I think it's a really challenging thing to do because technology does change, very rapidly. and even thinking about, I mentioned this need for greater transparency on the part of platforms, which which I stand by. But the reality is that, the platforms change the way they do things regularly. So, knowing how an algorithm works, or knowing how, why you're seeing the ads that you're seeing, you may understand it one day, but the next day it changes. So there's a lot of work to do for governments and for us as users in trying to keep up.
Thank you, Kara Zed. And we have a bunch of audience questions coming in. I'd like to get to those now. And one is related to what you just mentioned regarding AI. This is from Jerry. Please discuss the role of AI in identifying content that should be considered for removal.
I can take a go at that to start. Yeah, so platforms, as I mentioned, kind of typically tend to resort to technology, not surprisingly, as a fix for things, which is good, and there is value in that, but it's not a sort of full stop. And AI, there certainly are the uses of AI in different platform uses of AI to identify inappropriate content, hateful content, and so on. The challenge is that, as Kara Z just mentioned, the content is changing, the environment is changing, and we, for lack of transparency, don't fully understand how the algorithms are working. So it is hard for people working in the space to be able to, for example, track how effective these things are. We actually really can't figure that out because there's proprietary reasons why we don't get to understand how those algorithms are working. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is that I can give an example from last year during the pandemic in 2020. QAnon on Facebook groups saw a 5,000% increase by a study from Moonshot. And this is, for the most part, like really explicit, in some cases, there's, really overt instances in which this is problematic. Platforms tend to crack down on it. It takes some time, as Kara mentioned, but, I use the example to flag how things that seem fringe can quickly move into the mainstream. And that is something that hate groups use to their advantage in their messaging and so on. So, it's partially because of the info economy and how quickly things can move from what we think are fringe into mainstream. And when things become mainstream, it becomes harder to crack down on using AI because they're trained typically on more fringe messaging, and then they have to be adapted and so on. So there's a lot of challenges, but yeah, it's partially because we can't track it and hold it accountable, and also partially because of the way the info economy changes so quickly.
Timothy, I saw something popping up there.
Yeah, it's to build on Kara Beebe's comment. I totally agree with her. You get these really fringe, I'm sure Kara's going to agree with this, that social media is a polarization machine, right? That's what it is. And it moves these fringe ideas to the middle. That 28% of Americans at one time believed the Bill Gates conspiracy theory. That's a hardcore conspiracy theory, that he caused the pandemic, to force vaccinations, to put microchips in us. Yeah, you got to be careful about these kind of surveys. It's an inherently limited methodology, but that it backs up exactly what Kara just said. And if this is feeding the algo, right, this is feeding the algorithm, it becomes really difficult to use it as a machine. Having said that, there have been some interesting studies, of course, showing AI is a tool that's we need it. We absolutely are going to need it in order to police the internet. But there also might be systemic biases built into those algorithms also that make it a less than ideal tool. But Kara's right. We need more research on this exact topic. The good news is, I think it's happening.
Yeah, I'm not a scholar of AI, but I would like to sort of highlight that, AI is not great with race, period. Yeah. It is just not good with race, and that we really need to keep. And because AI is a black box, we don't know once you put the garbage in, what it does with it, we have no idea. And so we have to be really, really careful about how we allow AI to determine what is truth when we know it's really bad probably with more things with this, but race definitely really bad.
And the other Kara, I see you want to jump in as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think there's some limited things that AI could be really effective at. I agree with everything that's already been said, but I think one thing AI could do is deal with the bots issue. So, identify who is a real person and who is not, and try and, because the bots can really contribute to the amplification of certain messages. And the other thing I think that, as far as sort of filtering content, what I've heard from people who know more about the technology than I do is that, it's relatively easy for a machine to identify child pornography, right? You can feed it a bunch of images of child pornography and it will eventually be able to recognize those images elsewhere. But that's not true for things like hate speech, for example, because hate speech is very contextual. You do really need to consider the full context in which it's happening to sort of understand on what side of the line it falls. I think the same is probably true for things like terrorist propaganda. So I think that, there's a role, but it's probably one that it has to be tailored to that specific thing that it's trying to identify. And it's definitely not going to, we for sure need it. I mean, the volume of content that is uploaded onto these platforms is not something that human beings alone could try and vet and moderate, but we do need to be really careful about how it's used, and the same kind of transparency that I'm talking about with, with algorithms, we need to bring to that technology.
Thank you. We have more audience questions coming in. I want to get to as many as possible. This is from SC. There have been a few calls to implement an Etribunal social media council type oversight mechanism to assess and regulate online speech. Do you think this regulatory response will be effective?
I can start on that one if you want. The typical lawyer answer, it depends. It depends a lot on what it looks like. And I'm not actually sure that, there has been talk about this, and there was some important work done by the Public Policy Forum that suggested doing something like this. The sort of rumors that I guess I've heard from coming out of the government don't suggest that that's necessarily the way things will go. But I think a social media council is an interesting idea. I think it has the potential to be a more democratic approach to regulation than some other models. But there's really just a lot of unknowns about how this would work. Similarly, an e-tribunal, I think we've experimented with this in Canada in some particular pockets and some particular areas, but it's all pretty new. It's all still sort of at the pilot project stage, I think. So, I think it's something we could experiment with. I think also, there is, and you find this even on social media, people will say something on social media, and a little while later they'll decide, I really shouldn't have said that, and then they'll take it down themselves. And I think there are some mechanisms.
Well, that's when you end up on a reality show. That's how that works.
But there are some mechanisms I think that we could implement that would get people to to take that pause and to think about things a bit more. And I guess the e-tribunal is a potential sort of middle ground, but it's probably not appropriate for certain things. I think that if we're talking about something like hateful content, it's probably not the kind of thing you're going to want to engage with through that kind of process.
All right, thank you. I want to get to some more questions here. This question is from Jay, and it's something that a few of you have mentioned. What is the role of media literacy in this, and whose shoulders does this responsibility rest? And I think that speaks to funding, jurisdiction, rollout.
I'm happy to take a crack being the representative from Canada's Digital Media Literacy Organization. I would say, and this kind of backs onto what the last question we just had, and my co-presenters have all kind of spoken to this. It's a kind of whole of society, multifaceted approach. But we can't regulate ourselves out of a social problem, for example, and entirely. And that is the role of public education. In Canada, we do not have a national digital media literacy strategy, approach, framework. Other countries do. Our counterparts in the UK, our counterparts in Australia, other Scandinavian countries. There is a national, support framework desire to make sure that the population is equipped with the skills and tools for all kinds of the critical thinking, for all kinds of online engagement, from ethical digital citizenship to recognizing fact from fiction to being able to frankly engage politically and access basic services. So this is one thing that we are certainly advocating for, in the Canadian context. And I would say conversations like this just highlight the need for support at a national level. In terms of who should carry it out, I think it will be a multifaceted approach. I mean, that will involve, to some degree, a public, school at the youngest age, but also we need to, get other, community organizations on board, different government departments on board to be responsible for different aspects of this, because we are not experts in all the things and we need to draw on other people's expertise.
Thank you. Next question is for Timothy. Karen asks, I would like to believe that an intervention can succeed in dispelling misinformation online, but are there examples of such success? And Timothy, I'm wondering if you can speak to what could individuals do? Because I think a lot of people just block or defriend that friend or family member and give up because it's not worth it. So how can anyone who's watching tonight try to do this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I often get the comment, it just doesn't feel like debunking works. It just feels so futile. But there really is a pretty robust body of evidence now that suggests that debunking, some people don't even like that term, and I sympathize with that because it feels unilateral, feels combative, but let's own that term. It really does work. And, those strategies I outlined so quickly in my presentation have been shown through various methodologies that they can be effective. But what you want to think of, I think the core things you want to focus on is, you have reliable content that is shareable, right? And there's been a number of studies that have highlighted that. And I know Media Smarts also knows a lot about this. That content has to be shareable, has to be meaningful to the community that you're aiming it to. It has to come from the right voice. That's so important. And so when you're talking about social media, those are some of the things that you want to focus on. The other thing you want to think about is, don't get combative. It can be hard, but that thing I said about not, focusing on the general public, not the hardcore deniers. I really mean that. It's very, very difficult to change their minds. If you do go after them, often it just gives them an opportunity to double down. But you can still use, like the Bill Gates conspiracy theory idea as an opportunity to talk about the science, as an opportunity to talk about what the facts are for the general public. And if you do that, you can make a difference. Now, the other thing you have to remember is no one ever changes their mind in front of you. Your crazy uncle's not going to go, now that you mention it, Tim, you're right.
You are right. That's what we want to hear.
That never happens. What you want to do is you want to give them a path to the truth, right? You want to give them the tools that you want to give them that credible information that maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, or maybe not even this issue, but the next one, they're going to be more likely to ignore the noise and see the credible information. And we have to think about, I think, these kinds of interventions like a public health intervention. We're talking about moving the needle. We're talking about not making it worse, right? So that's also how we have to think about it. You're not going to change every mind, but these interventions, they matter.
Timothy, thank you. We have time for one last question. Want to squeeze it in? We have a minute or two for it. And Tamara, I'm going to send it your way. Maureen writes, this is great. However, I believe we're preaching to the converted right now. She writes, I suspect that most, if not all, offenders did not sign up for this webinar. So how do we make effective change if the offenders are not listening and have no interest in listening? Tamara, what would you say to that?
Oh, no, that's a way to end it. This is
a little real talk here, right?
I don't really have a great answer for that question. We all have to work together. I think to Tim's point, what I would say is when we think about this and we're thinking about interventions, it may not be about changing the person you're talking to. It's about the people that they're talking to, right? All of this is sometimes about the other people. It's not just, and so if people think that person is is a person to listen to and you provide them with information, it might help to like dispel the information down, right? And so I think we need to sort of think that we're not simply just dealing with the top person, we're dealing with other people, that people are in communities and we want to engage with those communities more broadly. But this is difficult. I mean, I think the other thing we didn't talk about that much is there, echo chambers are on this. That's a problem, right? People are going to get into their spots where, you're not going to be. And it's hard to deal with those people, as Maureen points out. So yeah, I don't have a great answer to that, but it's an excellent question.
Remembering that people make up the network and figuring out how we can best break through those echo chambers that ultimately we're all participating in as well. Well, thank you to all of our speakers, to Kara Brisson-Boivin, to Tamara A. Small, Kara Zwiebel, Timothy Caulfield. Great to see you. And this is our last event in our spring season. We're taking a break for the summer as we're all enjoying more time outdoors. We're going to be returning in September, though, with a full season of online events. Please check in with us at thewalrus.ca/events. At the end of August, you'll be able to see our schedule and register for any events that you're interested in. Also, we post all the videos from our events, including tonight's talks. You can find that online in the Walrus Talks video room on our website. Please keep an eye on your inbox. We're going to send you an email as a follow-up to this event. And the best way to not miss a future event is to opt in to our newsletter. At the Walrus, we believe that trustworthy journalism is an essential service. And with your support, we can continue to provide fact-checked, long-form journalism that Canadians can rely on. So if you enjoyed this free event tonight, please consider making a donation at thewalrus.ca. You can click on donate. All gifts of $20 or more receive a charitable tax receipt. Thank you to Rachel, Kevin, Mark, Aaron, Megan, and Tammy at Facebook Canada for making this conversation possible, and our year-long partnership together on the future of the internet. We'll be back again in September with more of the Walrus Talks on the future of the internet specifically. A big thank you to our annual sponsors, Inspire, Labatt Breweries of Canada, Air Canada, Shaw, and Facebook Canada. Community is really important in these COVID times, and each one of you in our audience tonight is a part of that. Thank you so much for joining us. Merci, miigwech. Have a great evening and summer ahead.